Grandpa Ron here again. Hope you're all having a great day. Today we're going to get back into our very basic Bible study, and we're going to start looking at the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges was probably written by Samuel, and I've got some dates written down here that I'll have to refer to, but historically the Bible scholars believe that it was written somewhere between 1040 and 1020 BC. But the period it covers is anywhere from 1446 or so to 1051 BC. So it was written a little afterwards, but it's a historical account of a period where God used judges to rule a land. And as I mentioned last time, they went beyond the definition of judges today. They had enforcement powers and military involvement. They were basically ruling the land in this theocracy. Theocracy being a government ruled by God himself through the priests. And when Israel would get into trouble, God would raise up a judge, special judge, to be used by God to get them out of their predicament, so to speak. That's as basic way I can describe it. Now, the book of Judges is going to have a lot of names, and I'm going to mispronounce a lot of them, but there is a website I'm going to put on here, up above here, that you can go to, and you can type in the name, and it will actually pronounce it for you. You can hear it being pronounced. And I've done that, but there's so many names I can't remember all of them, so I'm going to do the best I can with the names. There's also some difficulty determining the sequence of events that occur here, because as we read in the book of Joshua, just before he died, he summoned the people together in different groups, the rulers, remember, and then the people, and he admonished them to trust God, and God would deliver them and drive out their enemies from within the promised land and give them victories. And he was concerned, we could tell, he was concerned that they weren't going to follow through with this. And we're going to see in Judges that he was correct. But the book starts off talking about after Joshua died. But then it's going to talk about some things, and then it's going to repeat later in the next chapter after Joshua dies. Well, what we're going to look at is we're going to take the position that the opening verse here in Joshua 1:1 is a overall statement of the book. Then we're going to see some things that happened shortly after Joshua's death. And in the next chapter, we're going to see kind of a flashback, brief flashback. We're just going to talk about when Joshua died again. But don't let that bother you. What we're going to see is a description of how the children of Israel moved in to take over the land, and how they were successful in some respects. But we're going to see that they turned their back on the Lord. They did not follow through on what they were commanded, and we're going to see all through the book of Judges how they fell short, then turned back to God, then fell short again. Actually, if we jump way ahead and we look at the very last verse in the book of Judges, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That kind of summarizes the book of Judges. There was no king, there was no great man like Moses or Joshua. God wanted the theocracy to work through ruling through the priests. But the priests, whether they didn't do their job or the people themselves just lost interest and became war weary or whatever, they did not follow through on what God had told them to do. And they're going to pay the price for it during the book of Judges and really throughout all history, even up until today. So let's take a look at Judges, chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Now how the Lord communicated that, we're not sure of. Remember, we talked about the Urim and Thummim. Can't even pronounce those right. How they would use those in making determinations. It wasn't really a lottery, but they would propose the question holding one stone and they would get an answer. We don't really know how that worked, but they could have used that method, via the priests. Or God could have spoken directly to the priests. The tabernacle was in full function then. They were doing the sacrifices. Moses had laid all that out. That was functioning. It could be that he spoke to them directly. We're not quite sure. But anyway, they knew what God's instructions were. Verse 3. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, Come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. Now this makes sense because the allotted territories, remember, the Simeonites had property that was actually within the borders of Judah. So it would make sense that they would work together. Verse 4, And Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. Now it's clear here that things are starting off well in the book of Judges because God has given them the victory, which means most likely they were following through on what God commanded, and they were trusting the Lord. Verse 5, And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Now this seems pretty barbaric, but this was these kings were intended to lead the people in battle, and by cutting off their thumbs and toes, they couldn't hold a weapon and they couldn't retain their balance. And this was something that was not uncommon. Now the Jews normally I don't think would have done this, but as we're going to see in the next verse, there's a justification. Verse 7, And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table, as I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. So he had done this to a lot of kings before him, and he recognized, eye for an eye. I'm getting what I deserve because I did this to 70, and now it's happening to me. Verse 8, Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. So here we see this progression where they're clearing out the promised land as God has instructed. Verse 10, So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of the Beer, And the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sefer. A lot of these names get confusing, but it's basically just a history of military movements. Verse 12, and Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will even give him my daughter Asha for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Asha for a wife. I'm not sure of the significance of this, but we'll continue on here. We're going to see that she's going to ask for some special favor. Then it came about when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. Then she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of Negev, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And this makes sense because this particular area, the only time they can get water in the dry season is through these springs. Verse 16, and the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah in the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. And they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Again, just an ongoing recount of the military movements of the people. Verse 19, now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now here it gives the reason that they couldn't take it was because they had iron chariots. But later we're going to see that God admonishes them because in God's eyes they didn't take it because they didn't trust in God. Because God had told them, if you trust in me, I will give you the victory. Remember, we saw that all the way back in Joshua. And so the real reason is not because of the chariots, it's because the children of Israel's lack of faith and trusting God for what he said he would do. Verse 20, then they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Now we're starting to see maybe some war weariness set in or some lack of faith. Remember, these battles don't just happen boom, boom, boom. This is a period of time. So we have soldiers that were alive when Joshua was alive. They're passing away now too. The new generation taking over. It could be that they're a little cool to God's commands, not as faithful. They haven't been through what some of the predecessors have been through. But at any rate, they're not following through. We're going to see this build up, and they're going to wind up paying the price later. Verse 22, likewise the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city formerly was Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. They don't want just the entrance. They want to know where the weaknesses are, where they can attack the city. Verse 25, so he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. That would have been up in Syria. Verse 27, but Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshan and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in the land. Well, why didn't they prevail? Well, the implication is that we can draw the inference that they weren't believing God. They weren't trusting God, because God had told them, if you trust me, I will drive these people out. So we see more groups being left in the land that God had told them to drive out. Verse 28, and it came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Might have been a little selfish motive here. If we drive them out, we lose them as slaves or as laborers. So they wanted to keep them in the land, I suppose. And it goes on, verse 29. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. So the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Again, instead of driving them out, they're going to use them. Verse 31. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Ashib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. The important thing we're going to see later is not only did they let them live in the land, but we're going to see in chapter 2 that over time they started to worship their gods. They started to intermarry with them. So it's just not a matter of letting them stay in the land. They went beyond that even. Verse 33. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anath became forced laborers for them. So here's even more that they didn't drive out. Verse 34. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, and Aijalon, and in Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. We see time after time after time, whether it's, like I said, due to war weariness or a lack of faith or whatever, they just didn't drive them out. Verse 36, and the border of the Amorites ran from the Asik Arabim, from Selah and upward. The book starts out good. They're trusting the Lord. They're moving in. They're driving people out of territories. But some of the children of Israel, some of the tribes didn't follow through. And they're allowing Canaanites and others to stay in the land. And we're going to see in the next chapter how that contaminates the theocracy, waters down the theocracy, actually gets to the point where the children of Israel are doing evil in the sight of the Lord. And they're going to pay for that, unfortunately. Well, I know this is kind of a complicated description of these military movements, but I hope it's been meaningful to you and you can get a gist of where the book is going here. We will talk about what happens because of what we've read here next time. But in the meantime, God bless. Bye-bye.